Ich freue mich, wie gesagt, sehr, dass dieser heutige Abend hier stattfinden kann. Es ist die letzte Ausstellungswoche zu Hamid Zénati All Over und wir haben das große Glück, dass Carolyn Kent den weiten Weg aus Chicago gekommen ist, um heute zu uns zu sprechen und uns ihre Arbeit vorzustellen. Carolyn, I was just saying that how happy I am that you made the effort to come all the way from Chicago to Munich to speak to us tonight, and that it was somehow my dream for some time to be able to invite you, and this was really the perfect occasion, because ever since I started engaging with Hamid Zénati's work, I was somehow reminded of your work, and I thought, I would be so curious what Carolyn Kent how would she respond to Hamid Zénati's work. So I'm really happy that we together made it happen, that you're here tonight. I will give a very brief introduction, who you are, and then I'll give the stage over to you. Also mit Carolyn Kent haben wir wirklich eine außergewöhnliche Künstlerin hier heute Abend zu Besuch. Sie wird über ihre Arbeit sprechen und im Anschluss haben Sie die Gelegenheit und wir alle gemeinsam vielleicht auch noch in ein kurzes Gespräch zu kommen und vielleicht sogar auch noch die ein oder andere Beziehung zu Hamid Zénati aufzumachen. Ich verfolge, wie gesagt, die Arbeit von Carolyn Kent schon einige Jahre und bin fasziniert, und Sie vielleicht auch gleich, von dem Reichtum ihrer Formen, der Farbnuancen ihrer Bilder und der einzigartigen Sprache, die sie entwickelt hat. Die Praxis der Künstlerin basiert in Malerei, hat sich aber in den letzten Jahren auch in skulpturale und performative Bereiche hin weiterentwickelt. In den letzten Jahren und gerade jetzt, im letzten Jahr, hat sie auch mehrere große Wandarbeiten realisiert. Das finde ich auch nochmal ein sehr interessanter Aspekt ist, eben weg von der Leinwand hin auf die Wand zu gehen. Ihre Arbeit ist bekannt für die eben sehr farbintensiven Formen, die ihren Weg meistens aus einem schwarzen Hintergrund bahnen. Hierbei formuliert Kent ein einzigartiges Malereivokabular, das sie wie eine Fremdsprache, also tatsächlich wie eine Sprache einsetzt, wenn auch eine, die die Grenzen der Lesbarkeit austestet. In einer Art von visuellen Übersetzungsarbeit, von Ideen zu Formen, spielt die Künstlerin mit dem Potenzial von Sprache, Bedeutung zu erzeugen und dennoch zu verbergen. Carolyn Kent ist 1975 geboren und lebt und arbeitet in Chicago. Einer ihrer großen Wandarbeiten ist derzeit in der Serie von The Modern Window im Außenraum des Museum of Modern Art in New York zu sehen. Ihre Arbeiten wurden außerdem unter anderem am Guggenheim Museum in New York und am Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago ausgestellt und sind Teil zahlreicher öffentlicher Sammlungen, darunter auch das Berkeley Art Museum und Pacific Film Archives, das Art Institute of Chicago und das Walker Art Center. Sie hat zahlreiche Auszeichnungen erhalten, unter anderem 2021 den Joyce Alexander Wine Artist Prize, das Studio Museum in Harlem und 2020 den renommierten John Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant. Carolyn Kent ist außerdem Assistenzprofessorin für Malerei am Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences der Northwestern University in Evanston. Wir haben auch das Glück, kann ich vielleicht in dem Rahmen auch kurz sagen, dass Carolyn morgen an der Akademie hier Studio-Visits machen wird und auch da nochmal diesen Dialog mit einer jüngeren Generation von Künstlern und Künstlerinnen weiter fortführen wird. Ich habe ja schon erwähnt, dass es gewissermaßen mein Traum war, Sie hier einladen zu können und eben gerade in Dialog zu bringen mit Hamid Zénatis Arbeit. Hamid Zénati und Sie haben zwar sehr unterschiedliche Biografien, dennoch verbinden Sie auch einige Dinge und Aspekte in Ihrem Leben und Ihrer Arbeit. Sie verbindet eine schier unerschöpfliche Fülle an Formen, Mustern und der Kombination von Farben, ebenso die Verwendung von Schablonen, die Expansion von der Leinwand direkt auf die Wand, die Experimentation mit performativen Elementen und vor allem auch die Verbindung zu Sprache und das Schöpfen aus unterschiedlichen kulturellen und sprachlichen Hintergründen. Und ich denke, darüber werden wir sicher gleich mehr von der Künstlerin hören. Ich freue mich jetzt sehr und bin gespannt auf Ihren Vortrag. I'm pleased to hand over to you now. And yes, we'll be able to engage in a few questions after her lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. So I guess I don't have to project. Everybody can hear me really well? Okay, wonderful. Well, I just want to say, first of all, thank you for Anna. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It's my first time in Germany. I have traveled a little bit in Europe, but I have never been to Germany. And it actually feels there's something familiar and there's something quite pleasant. I've enjoyed this last day walking around, getting to know your city. And I want to thank everyone, and Valerie, for your help and support, getting everything set up for this evening. And thank you all for coming tonight. I know that I'm competing with beautiful weather out there. I was just like watching the surfing and I had to remind myself to come and give a lecture. So thank you so much. For tonight's lecture, I'm going to be discussing my practice, and I find that the intersections between language, abstraction, and painting are not so dissimilar from like Hamid Zénati's work as well. I feel that there's a kindred way that our practices overlap. And so for those of you that are familiar with his work and practice, you'll probably be noticing there are ways in which abstract painters think that kind of align in certain ways. So that'll stand out. I thought it would be great to first start off with a little bit of a bio of where I grew up in the US and to give you some background on how I've even come to be an artist. And I grew up in Illinois, so currently I live in Chicago, but where I grew up is very rural. It's 2 hours outside of the city, and there's lots of cornfields. And so it's near Iowa, and it's just a wide open landscape. It's definitely the plains. It's very flat. When you drive from Chicago to my city, it is just flat, and you see red barns. It's very classic in that way of Americana. But I think that growing up there really kind of gave me a sense of security and a desire for my imagination to grow. And I think that is totally the foundation of my practice, is imagining and thinking how things in the world connect. And that happened from a very young age. I grew up in a family with an identical twin, and we were 4 girls total. And I think, one of my earliest influences comes from watching black and white films with my mother on Saturday mornings. So Saturday mornings would be, I'm home from school and mom turns the television on and there are these old movies that come on. And I remember learning patience as a child, learning to sit still and listen and watch for the storyline, because I had so much energy as a child. It's a wonder I could do that. But there was something that always stayed with me about these films. And I remember asking my mother, did people really talk like this in the old days? And my mother didn't actually have a great answer. I mean, she was like, actually, I'm not certain, maybe in New England. But I later learned that this kind of stage language was something of the theater. But the way that scripts were written really had an impact on me, because the language was really, really sharp, and it was really close to the literary. And for me, that really intrigued me. And that left a kind of impression. Pictured here, this is from a classic film with Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, who were actually kind of film rivals in real life. And the way that this is from a film called Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and it's about a film actress that has aged out of the theater, and she has to take care of her sister. But what really struck me was the writing, and that stayed with me kind of all the way until I got to grad school. And so grad school becomes this next moment in my life where I start thinking about language. But I'll back up one. So before I went to grad school, I knew I wanted to travel and get out of the country, so my twin sister and I left the country. I ended up going, I joined the Peace Corps, which is a volunteer service for 2 years, where you can teach English, you can work with a small business, there's health. There are a few different divisions, but I decided to teach English in the country of Romania. And so I was in the small city of Alba, which is in Transylvania. And that was kind of my first real exposure to hearing a foreign language in a context outside of film. So that brings me to this slide, which I watched a lot of international films, I would say from my teenage years on. And that was the way that I kind of was able to leave the country before actually physically leaving the country. That was my way of traveling. That was my way of peeking inside other cultures. And there was something about the subtitle, the translation, that really struck me. It made me fascinated with other kinds of languages. And so I think that those two moments, which are filmic moments, those two had a great impact on thinking about painting. So that kind of brought me up to some early works that I made right after graduate school. And so what you're looking at, these are quite small. And I was really fascinated by my graduate professors often saying the language of painting. And painting in and of itself is a language, and it kind of develops for through each artist's style. My interest was quite piqued when I heard language. Oh, so maybe painting language can be somehow, I can connect this with actual language and the ways in which language can communicate. I was fascinated by abstraction because abstraction can be coded and you can hide things in it and you can be subversive. There were so many things you could do with abstraction. That's what really got me excited. So in this work, I decided to take small sheets of paper and make these small abstract paintings on them. And I kind of made a rule where I would use black plus one other color. So here you have what is called like a Titan buff. It's like a cream color. And I would make these abstractions and then I would pair them with text at the bottom. If you can't read that, I'll read it to you. It says, "I saw a man who looked like you, sat like you. Dare I say, he even drank his coffee like you. I'm inclined to think that we are all performing one another, one big circus of imitation." And so these writings were really inspired by those black and white films. They were inspired by the kind of language that comes out of the literary, that has like sharp wit, a sharp tongue, that has double meanings, that is biting, and that can cut. And I found that that's when it was most exciting to watch those films, to get that. And so most of these, they're about 6 by 8 inches, and I know you work in centimeters, and I don't know how to do that translation, but they're quite small, about this size actually. And after the paintings were made, I would put them through the typewriter because I liked the mediation of this apparatus. I liked that there was something I could do that actually could have mistakes built into it. So sometimes there's a flaw with the typewriter, and I leave the mistake in there because it would make these nice slippages in language that kind of implied a layer of meaning that was accidental. And that for me was also exciting to discover. I could read that one to you as well. "He tended to his vanity like a well-manicured English garden, taking hours to arrange himself for outings, completely obscuring any hint of imperfection. Poised he was, like a photograph of plastic flowers." Now, did I sometimes find inspiration from people I met in real life? Yes. But they were really fun to invent, you know. I didn't borrow the language, I invented it, and it really actually gave a place for a lot of writing I would do. I think in another life I was meant to be a B actress, not A, just like B, community theater maybe, but I became a painter instead. So this was something that I kind of really started thinking about language, and it got the ball rolling. Then I came across Herta Müller, who is a Romanian-born German novelist, poet, essayist, a recipient of the 2009 Nobel Prize in Literature. And what I was struck by was hearing this lecture she gave on translation. And for me, it really struck because she spoke about how the sound of the bird, learning it in the Romanian context, and then and knowing what it means based on just the sound. And the name of the bird is rândunica, and it like the way that you say it actually sounds like the sound of the bird. And there was something really beautiful and poetic in that. And being on the outside of language, looking into another language, that was kind of the perspective I often took. I also like the way that she talked about each language has different eyes sitting inside its words. And so the thing that compelled me the most about abstract painting was that there was no literal translation. There was no people group that were privy to what the language meant, not even myself. Like, it doesn't have a direct translation that goes into a specific language. I think the kind of translations that can happen are the emotive, they are sensory, they're through the way that something might feel, or maybe they signify and signal towards something in the real world. So I decided to really take on painting at this moment. This was about 2013, 2014, and I decided to start building up a language and really build it and give myself kind of freedom of form. So what you're looking at here is an image of a former studio I had, and I placed them all on the wall. I kind of used the same, I made a rule, and I was going to use an all black ground for these paintings. And one of the reasons I did that was in my journey as a painter, when I discovered what, that's okay, no worries. When I discovered, I made some paintings with an all black ground, and it was almost like I had this revelation, like, whoa, color does something so different on a black ground. Almost as, I mean, in some ways, almost as if I had never explored that before. And there was something really unique. I started to recognize that the colors became a luminous, like black illuminated color. I thought that black would subdue them. I thought it would dampen them. I thought it would like soak up something from them, but I felt that it did actually the opposite, and that fascinated me. The works that you're going to look at, they're all 22 by 30. So I kind of worked with a standard size of really nice drawing paper, and then I covered the nice drawing paper with paint. So I used black gesso, and then I kind of approached it as a study. Like, where are the borders of this language? And so it became a daily activity of just working on 5 to 10 paintings a day. And these were quick. These are done where it's funny because when I look at them, they look really complete. They look like a complete painting, but they were done in one sit down. I didn't revisit them over time. I didn't work on them and then come back the next day. I just made them. And I tried lots of different approaches. Some of the approaches are where I manipulated the background with a sponge or a rag, but other times mainly it's a paintbrush. And I'm working in acrylic paint, so it dries very quick. And one thing about, this point in my life, I had just had my first child, and I think like I definitely felt the pressure, and I'm certain the pressure could definitely be universal, but I felt this pressure at that time, post-grad school. I'm going out to openings, people are out and about and on the scene, and when you have a child, typically people retreat. And I'm talking about women. Women retreat and stay home. And so I didn't want my practice to suffer at that time, and I didn't want to compromise. Or I didn't want to like fulfill some kind of prophecy that people might have for my practice. So after having my first child, I gave myself a kind of goal. I thought, I want to make 100 paintings on paper the first year. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but it was a great goal because I thought, even if I fall short, I'll have a nice collection. Even if there's 15, 20. But I found that, because I worked so quickly and I didn't belabor it, because right now I'm just finding the borders. I'm finding what I'm drawn to. I'm actually figuring out more about myself at this time more than the painting. And it was really, I explored. I know that a lot, often people will ask me, where did your forms come from? And the forms really came from different things I had seen in my life. And that's why there's a way that they look kind of in between things. Maybe a sculpture, somewhat architectural. maybe a constellation, maybe a kind of mapping. You know, there was a way that this language was slowly getting built, and over time I started to notice, like after, you know, when I would lay them out on the ground right in my apartment, my studio was in the apartment at that time, and I worked with my child in the baby carrier right next to me. Thankfully, he was such a content baby. I got a lot of work done, but I started to notice patterns, and I started to notice what would keep reoccurring and what would get left behind. And that was really exciting after, you know, a year of just making. And there was no pressure. I didn't really feel any pressure. I found a real kind of freedom. And that's something that I often, you know, now in life, I feel like I've got different pressures and demands. Things have shifted a lot. But I like to go back to thinking about that time because it was just me alone in my studio. And I really started to articulate for myself what I wanted. What did I want for my career? What did I want with my practice? And I really started to dream. And I can't emphasize it enough that the busyness of life totally steals that at times. And I think about that a lot. I go and I try to get back to that. So I wanted to include some images just of my studio and how I'm working. This is a different studio now, but a lot of times I use cut paper. Cut paper is a way to find shapes and forms, and it's very immediate. It's really funny because I think, like, having a child, there was a time when I needed things to be quick, but I haven't necessarily lost the work that was established, the way of working, establishing it. I like to cut things out of paper. I like to find shapes. That's how I find the shapes. I don't draw to find shapes. I'm always cutting out a piece of paper. And it's labor intensive. So, you know, I did a lot of this work myself, and it wasn't up until a year and a half ago. I now have a studio assistant, and I like to keep just one studio assistant because I don't want the studio to become a factory. I want it to remain kind of modest in the way it works. But it's a lot. And it's funny, I'm wearing a mask because I'm overly cautious. Even though it's just acrylic paint, I'm like, I don't know what this is going to do in 30 years. So I wear that, and it also, that paint kind of irritates me a little bit. But this is just black gesso, and it's quite a labor-intensive process. There are 3 coats of black gesso that go on one side. I staple the canvas to the wall, and then I take it off the wall, roll it up, turn it over, staple it back to the wall, and then I paint 3 more coats of gesso, this time sanding in between each layer. And then after that, I put on a layer of Mars Black acrylic paint. And Mars Black is unique because it's one of the warmer blacks. Shadows show up in it. It's very sensitive. And there's, I don't know, 5 different kinds of black, but that's the one I just got into and I started liking a lot. A lot of times in my studio, I like to have different works up. This is not always easy because a lot of that space is workspace. But I like to be around and in the studio. I like to be around the work. I like to see it. I like to think about it. I oftentimes will work and then photograph it on my phone just so I can think about it later. It's almost like I'm figuring out that composition in my spare time, like it's in my psyche somewhere. And I'm figuring out how to resolve it. And this is a picture of me and my daughter, Nina. But in there, you know, I have books laid out, I have different works on tables, there's some sculpture there. And this was a modest-sized studio. Well, I mean, I say modest, but this is actually a huge studio. For in the United States, I feel like a lot of my friends would agree that this is a really big studio. And especially if I can fit like 3 to 6 paintings on the wall that are this size, they're pretty big. They're about 9 feet tall. Again, I'm using feet and inches. And they're about, I'd say, 7 feet wide. So they're quite tall. And you can see, I think I have a picture of me on a scaffold. So I work on multiple at once. My practice is where now I like to work on 3 or 4 at the same time, because typically what happens is I run into issues. I'll work on one steadily and then I get stuck and I'm like, I don't know what to do. And I like to take time. I like to take time to stop and sit with it for a while. The nature of deadlines these days doesn't always provide for that, but I think like sitting with the work a while has been really helpful. So you can get a sense of scale here. You can get a sense of how big they are. You know, for a long time, even when I was pregnant with my second child, I was working on a ladder, and it just occurred to me like I could be working on a much safer thing than a ladder. So I definitely work on scaffolding now, but I feel like even that is getting precarious the older I get, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to have something invented where it's some kind of platform I just walk up to. But they're high up. They're high up. This is just a view of kind of the things. There's models, maquettes, there's books that I paint book covers. Something that came about just as almost like a hobby. I had this, in the US there are lots of thrift stores, and thrift stores have so many books, and it's almost like it's like a graveyard. These books, nobody's going to really invest in them. Some of them are so outdated in their information. So it was a way for me to kind of give them another life. I started covering them in canvas, and then it was just a practice, and then it became something more substantial later. So I really advocate for kind of doing this thing that you feel intuitively, because it leads to something else later, potentially. And this shows you I'm up on a small ladder, but I was up on a much higher ladder. I can't believe that, but you know, things change. I wanted to bring up, this is my husband, he's also an artist, Nate Young, and I included him here because, you know, working in proximity to each other, I feel that there has been a lot of influence. Here, I wouldn't call him a woodworker, because that kind of feels like a label for someone that only works in wood. He's an artist that has a conceptually based practice, and so he works in wood, he makes drawings, he does performance, but his woodworking, that's what's kind of, you will see throughout my practice the influence it has had. And it's also, you know, if as an artist, oftentimes if you don't have the skill to do something, you work with a fabricator. And I often have worked with fabricators for things, but you know, being married to a fabricator has made it so easy to kind of realize some of the ideas I had so quickly. And that has been a huge bonus. And so there are some works that we've done together. And I'm hoping, like in the future, there's more collaborations. I don't know how it is in Europe, but I still think it's quite a rare thing to have a partner that's an artist where you work together on things. And I really think that's part of my narrative that I want to come out more. So yeah. So after making those 90 some works on paper, I didn't make 100, but I got to 90, and that felt really great. And so after having this large collection, I started thinking about it as an archive. And I started thinking about it as a site that I could return to over time and make other kinds of work from. That was really exciting to me, because a lot of painters at that time, one of the reoccurring themes that I felt I heard from them was that they would look out into the world, and they were often needing more inspiration. And I liked the idea of looking more into myself for inspiration or for ideas. So creating this collection of works as an archive was very appealing to me, that I could continue to pull out. Instead of looking out in the world for something new, I could continue to pull out from this site. So what you're looking at is a painting here, and on either side of the painting, the walls have been built out. And on top of those walls are shaped wooden sculptures. Well, they're paintings that are wooden. They function kind of in between painting and sculpture. But this is the first time that I'm thinking toward engaging the architecture of the space, making that space respond to the work that's in it. So this is a theme that later comes up. This was kind of an early move to do that, and I'm really glad that the gallery allowed to do that. I had them fabricated so that it felt like there was a threshold to get to the painting. these are just examples of some of the kinds of ways I was working on the canvases. A lot of times when I first started making these paintings, the black was operating solely as a ground. At this point, I'm really thinking about blackness as a site. And what could happen in that site? What does it mean to make a language that sits in a site of blackness? And I was thinking about the different kinds of metaphors that exist for blackness. I'm thinking about sites of the unknown, whether that's the cosmos, way out in outer space where we have limited understanding of what is out there, or else under the sea. You know, now because of really great technology, we know what's under there, but that aquatic life is still somewhat of a mystery, and how that world exists. So I liked the idea to think of blackness as a metaphor for the unknown and the mysterious and what can come up out of this site. And thinking about language, what does it mean for a language to originate in this place? Another thing that I found really exciting was that when I went from I worked on the ground a lot. I worked, at a table to make the drawings on paper. When I scaled up, black shifted from being just a color. It became an atmosphere. It became space. And that was something I was not even prepared for. But I really appreciated it, that my practice was teaching me something back that was kind of unique. So I kept relating to black as a color this whole time, and now black becomes a space. It's becoming a substance. And later you'll notice that black ends up coming over the surface. You would think that I would have thought to do that early on, but it took me like over a year of making paintings to think, I could bring black in over the surface and push everything underneath. And that came about actually from, making mistakes and then thinking, I don't like any of this, so I'm gonna black out the composition. And when I did that, there was residual, shapes under the surface that were really exciting to see, that kind of spoke of the history of how I built the painting. This is from an exhibition I had where I'm making freestanding sculpture alongside sculptures that are on the wall, and also painting on the wall. So underneath the little blue shape on the far left, that's a direct painting on the wall of black, and then there's a painting hanging on the wall and a sculpture. I wanted to engage everything in the space, from the wall to what sits on the wall, to the painting, to objects, and then ultimately to performance. So I started understanding that this language starting to feel like it has a mind of its own. And the language wanted to not stay in just two dimensions. It wanted to move out and affect the room. That became quite exciting for me because I always knew that painting wasn't enough for me. I like making paintings, but I wanted to do more. I wanted to keep exploring. And this drawing that's up on the screen is one way that I explored also the archive. I made a set of drawings, and then I attached instructions to the different shapes that came up. This became then a kind of score that could be then performed by performers. And that, some of them, I can read these too. One of them says, a movement that looks like an escape, a durational embrace of many, 3 chords played on the xylophone. So they were instructions, but they were quite random. And I was really curious if these were to be performed, how that might look. But I left it quite open. I wanted it to serve as a score. And this is an image of, I worked with these really wonderful university theater students. And we did activities like this where I would give them the prompts, and then they were able to act out impromptu in front of the paintings. And this is something that I did not do for an exhibition. It was something solely I did during a residency, and it was really for myself to kind of figure out, where does performance go from here? What did I learn? What did I gain? And it really helped to work with these young theater students that were super excited to just get into character. It was really an exceptional performance. Then I actually did a performance, and I hired 2 women to perform, and I allowed them to interpret the work and create dance and movement from that. So this was an opportunity for a translation to take place beyond what I was doing. I really saw that as I moved from painting to the wall to the sculpture, I started seeing these as acts of translation. I really was thinking, like, if this is a kind of language I have developed, I want to see it translated into other kinds of works. And I want to see that translated into other kinds of art. And so having these two dancers perform was really exciting. And the only instructions I gave them was, I kept encouraging them to move away from modern dance, move away from what they knew, move away from their traditional backgrounds in dance and movement, and to move into a space that was a little uncomfortable, totally different and strange, and move beyond the familiarity for them. And I found when I worked like that, there was something for both of us to gain. It wasn't just for them to fulfill something for me. I wanted them to get something out of the experience that was solely for them. And it was really wonderful. There was music. I hired a high school friend to create the music, and it was kind of like sci-fi jazz, which sounds really funny, science fiction jazz. It was weird. It felt like it was celestial. It felt like it took place on the moon, and I loved it. And it was a real interesting thing that I discovered along the way within the practice of bringing in performance. I have some other examples of exhibitions that I did and the ways that I kind of explored working with them. This was an exhibition where I wanted one color to kind of set the mood, set the tone. And these are the small works that are in the show. You'll notice back here there's a plant. These are fake plants. The gallery didn't want real plants, but I used fake plants. I'd used plants before. And you'll notice too that on the floor underneath the plant, the wall kind of comes down and there's color that goes onto the floor. I wanted boundaries to be broken. I wanted to kind of allude to a different way things want to operate with my work in it. That my work somehow asks the space to kind of break its own boundaries in certain ways. I started to bring in the use of wooden elements. So this painting has, it's a wooden shape on either side of it. And this was kind of the first iteration to think about how those objects outside the paintings might start to function. And this is a painting on paper. And so I'm kind of keeping everything in the room still. I want there to be multiple ways of working that kind of explore how this language wants to live. A lot of times, like I mentioned before, cut paper. I wanted to give a few examples of, this is like this big, it's very small. Sometimes I just get a stack of index cards and I sit at the kitchen table, and it's an activity I can do with my children. It's an activity I can do when I'm sitting watching TV or something. That it's just a different way of working. And I think that, a lot of times artists talk about being in the studio. It's like the best place to be. But sometimes the studio is in the living room. And sometimes it's at the grocery store. And sometimes the studio is at a coffee shop. And sometimes it's on a plane. Like the studio is it's more of a paradigm as opposed to a physical location. It becomes wherever you happen to be when you start thinking in ways that influence your practice. And so these are paintings on paper that were kind of directly made from the cut paper. And a lot of times I'm often scaling up. I'm often doing something that's 2 inches, like very small, and then I translate it on paper, and then it becomes like 15 times itself, and then it gets even larger. And I encourage, I'm a teacher as well, and so I often encourage my students, and I encourage young artists to kind of take those risks, to do those things, because it does feel like a risk. I recall early on having a curator in my studio, and I hadn't yet made a large-scale painting, and I'd only been working on paper, and I told him, yeah, I'm really excited. I can't wait. I want to try this, but really large. And he looked at me and said, oh, I don't know. That might not work. And I remember thinking, the audacity, like that's what we do as artists. You try things, and there's no failure. There isn't failure because it's a practice. You keep practicing. That's like trying to go out and win a race the first time you just try. It's like you practice these things. And so I was really shocked, and I'm certain that they weren't thinking that they were discouraging me, but I think that there are these kind of mythologies that exist. Like, you have to be safe, you better make sure you have a really good plan in place before you do something. And I think the studio is the last place you really want to do that. I mean, maybe for an exhibition, putting something together, you're going to, be mindful, but the studio is the place to really mess up, try things out, get messy, cut it up, burn it, throw it away, try it again, black it out, paint over it. Like, if you don't do that in the studio, where else do you do that? And so I have this philosophy that I don't believe in failure. Even if a work falls apart, I'm like, that's not a failure. That might be a material flaw, or maybe the sun got to it, but I don't think in those terms because it's so not helpful. And two, it doesn't keep you returning to something again. My expectations, I try to keep them really low. And it's great to keep them low because you're often surprised if you keep them low. So these works here, you'll notice they're not on a black ground. These are on Belgian linen. And so the Belgian linen was an opportunity for me to kind of flex a little bit and explore, working on a different ground. And I did not wait for permission to do that. And I say that because a lot of the times as an artist, when you start doing something you become known for, you feel like the expectations are, you better keep doing it this way. And now, when I used to hear older artists say things in their artist talk, I remember thinking no, really? Do people say those things? And I think it's something that happens in the culture, within the art world, that there are patrons of art and curators that have these kinds of expectations that when you start doing a thing, that you somehow continue and you stay doing that thing. And I never wanted to be trapped. So I decided, I really think I have something to say that's quite different from what the black paintings provide. And these provided me with opportunities to be really kind of distilled, poetic, minimal. And I saw these like poems. I saw the shapes could operate quite differently. I saw that the power in a form could just rest quietly. And that Belgian linen is so much like a fabric. I think I'll say it, I think it was really good to trust intuition and to do the thing. You'll notice that on either side of these are the wood. I started thinking about these wooden elements acting like parentheses, watching subtitles and seeing closed caption where you are getting descriptions on the television screen for the text inside. I started relating that to what was happening with the paintings. These paintings here, they really, to me, seemed like coded mysteries. They excited me because I could start to find different ways to signal toward a riddle. And that became really fun to operate like that. And I say it's fun because I have learned now to always privilege myself first before the expectations of thinking where the work is going to end up. Will people receive it? Will people like it? Will they respond to it? I really try to privilege myself first, what do I get from it? And after I get something from it, then I can move on. And so you'll notice the use of the wood, the influences that have come in from being around a partner that often works in wood. And it was a way to kind of provide a kind of frame that was untraditional, and it was operating in very different terms. So I just wanted to share a bit on how the forms in my work speak to other forms in the world. And so this is really where I think that maybe there is a connection with the way that Hamid Zénati also works, and finding things in the real world, and then as they are translated through an artist's own experience, and they're translated through the hand and the gesture and the mark, they form a language. And I think language is birthed out of, an artist's language is birthed out of their own personal experiences. And so these are a few examples. What you're looking at here is a series of works. And when I work in a series, I found it interesting how the work started to act almost like scenes from a play. And this is something I return to. It's definitely one of the themes in my work. I'm fascinated by the stage and the theater. And that series just made me think about like what these might look like translated into, you know, large sculptures on a stage, maybe scenography, which is definitely a modernist thing. Modernist artists have done this in the past, so it's not a new thing. But I'm trying to think about it, like how can I think about this in an expanded way beyond that? These are examples of stretched canvases, because a lot of my larger canvases are not stretched. That was a decision I made to keep them unstretched, hanging flat on the wall. What happens is, after the painting, after the process of priming it, it becomes kind of heavy, stiff, and it can stand on its own then. And I take the staples off, and I end up trimming with a pair of scissors. I trim both sides of the canvas and the bottom, and it holds its form. Now, when they travel, they do get rolled up, and so because acrylic is very flexible, once they travel to a destination, then you lay them out. That fold will slowly relax over time, and it'll stay flat. So this is an example of that. I attach an aluminum bar on the back, and it acts as a cleat. But the aluminum bar has holes in it, and so you drill that into the wall, and it's attached to the painting. So it looks, you can't tell how it's being held up. It's kind of floating up on the wall, which I liked, because what I thought is that it slows the viewer down some. It slows someone down from looking at it and dismissing it so quickly, like, oh, that's just a painting. It's like, I wanted a moment of just, wait a minute, how is that hanging up? How is that doing that? What is that material? So those were definite things that I did as a way to engage the viewer. But I found that, you know, thinking about language, the orientation was so fitting because it was the same orientation as a sheet of paper. So it was like writing. It stayed in the language of writing for me. And oftentimes you'll see in the paintings handmade marks that look like cursive writing. Sometimes they look like specific letters, but they're not. You'll see forms that almost resemble something like a hand, but it's not. It's not quite that. It's kind of in between. There are ways in which you'll find a black shape on top of another shape that creates a kind of window. That's how I started thinking about making a form inside a form. Like, doing that helped me think about the recessed space. So I'm going to move us quickly along. This was an exhibition. It's called Victoria Veronica, The Figment Between Us. So this was a really kind of fun shift in my practice. I was given this opportunity to have a solo exhibition, and I wanted to come up with a narrative to kind of frame how the language was operating. So I used my mother's first two names. Her first two names are Victoria and Veronica, and I imagined that these might be identical twins communicating. Now, what's funny about that is that I am an identical twin, and the reason I made it fiction was because I love fiction, like, and why not? Like, I wanted it to really stay in the imaginative. I wanted it to be made up. And so I started thinking about this narrative of how these identical twins communicate to each other through this language, through an invented twins language. And I started thinking about, you know, there are twins in the world that have secret communication. But beyond that, I wanted to think even more open about it, not so specific. Because my twin sister and I, as I grew up, we definitely had a language. But it's not unlike a language that even older couples might have after time. You know, there's a way you move with someone over time. There's a way you act at the table, you know, when you set your cup down, how you lay your clothing on your bed. There are ways in which you form a communication with a kindred person. And I wanted this one to stay in the language of sisterly, because it's so easy for me to go over into the romantic. So I was like, I don't want to make it about lovers. So I thought twins are kind of nice. They're siblings, they're sisterly, and there's an intimacy there. So this exhibition was a very small room, and I appreciated it because the smallness of the space allowed me to be poignant. I could be really poignant. And so I painted on the wall, And you'll notice there is a freestanding sculpture here. This is a table that I saw when I was visiting Mexico City. I visited the architect's studio, Luis Barragan, who is a famous Mexican architect. And I saw this table in there, and I wanted to bring it into my exhibition. So remade it, had it fabricated in plywood, and put some artworks on it, older artworks of mine. So I really started thinking about that object as a site that I could put other kinds of ways of working on it. And then I also painted on the wall what kind of resembles a floor plan. It's just the shape of a floor plan. And small works that were in this kind of coded language between the two sisters. There was also an element where inside the plant there was a speaker, and it had a frequency that you could hear. There was something I wanted to start thinking about of communication happening between the frequency of the sound. Like I said, the table had older artworks that I had never shown, artworks that maybe didn't seem to fit into the context of my larger practice, but ones that I really felt were important on my journey. Those are the ones I put in there. I started to make these kind of painted registers around the artwork to kind of signal toward their significance. So it was the first time I kind of introduced the twins, and the stakes were low because it was during COVID. I worked alone, and only one person at a time could see the exhibition. So it was a great opportunity to just have the freedom to do anything. And I think that freedom is something I talk about a lot because it's the one thing that I feel gets eclipsed the quickest for artists in their studio and when they're making. And I wrestle with this a lot with my students. I teach at Northwestern, and it's a program that is, it's really kind of situated around theory. So my students are often really theoretical, and that sometimes can prevent them from making an actual move and making something. My program I came out of at the University of Minnesota was very much about making. So I feel like the strength of the University of Minnesota was it produced a lot of makers, people that knew how to make things, and their craft skills were really good. And people did not hesitate to make a thing. And I think about this a lot because regardless of what program you come out of, there's always going to be a moment in your practice when one does not feel free, you feel a bit trapped. And I think something like that hit me when I walked into this exhibition of Hamid's is like the freedom. I feel like there's such a freeness about not only the presentations of the work, but also like in the way that they were made, their space. A lot of the shapes are floating in a kind of space, and it makes me think about freedom. And even though my work is pretty controlled and everything seems to be articulated a lot of times in these singular forms collected, freedom is always kind of at stake. To remain in that space, to be free, to explore, and to make mistakes. Even though the work, it's funny because when I look at the work, it doesn't look like there's mistakes, but I know that there's mistakes. I know all the works that are in between the ones that get put into the show, all the outtakes, all the false steps, and those works are just as important. So don't throw away any of your bad work if you make work. Like, don't throw it away. You got to live with it, and it's part of the story. So here are a few installation shots to give you a sense of scale and presence. This is at Casey Kaplan Gallery in New York. And I'm just going to run through these images. You know, one thing I haven't talked about is my color palette. And my palette was really influenced by my travel and my time in Transylvania. I grew up in the Midwest. You will rarely, maybe there it exists, but you won't see green and pink, bright green and bright pink houses. And like, I was in Romania in 2000, from 2000 to 2002, and it was like right when they were getting resources. So if there was, I learned this when I was there, if there was paint that came in that was bright orange, someone was like, we have not had bright orange for I don't know how long, and I'm going to paint my house that color. And like there were buildings that were like incredibly bright, but there were a lot of pastels. And so that's, you know, growing up in the Midwest, every house was like beige, white, blue, gray. It was very monotone. So when I traveled to Romania, it was like a fairy tale. It was really like, wow, you can paint your, like you can paint, the whole neighborhood could be all these different bright colors, and they were so pleasant. So that for me, I think it just stuck with me, that palette, because I use pastels a lot. And there's something also that happens with pastels and the color black. There's a way that the harmony I find that is produced between them is really sweet. And I don't know, that's maybe the only way I can get at it. There's a sweetness to it, there's a harmony that I have found that's really wonderful. So the last thing I'll show you is this, well, I don't know if this is the last, but I feel like we are running out of time, and I'm going to move us through this kind of quickly. This exhibition was the second time that I brought up Victoria and Veronica, and this time I had 2 rooms. Each exhibition space, one exhibition space became a reading room, and the other room became a writing room. And so the twins kind of communicated through different objects in these spaces. So there were books on a bookshelf, there was sculpture, there were paintings, and there were architectural interventions where there were recessed spaces in the wall. And this was really exciting to do. And I will say that, you know, working with a museum, this was a really interesting situation where they invited me to come do a project. And I thought, okay, when is this project gonna happen? And they were like, oh, this happens like 8 months out, 9 months. I thought, great. And then I get an email from them, literally like, I don't know, 3 weeks later, okay, so what do you wanna do? And I'm like, I don't know what I wanna do. I need more time. And they're like, well, we kind of need to know what you wanna do. And I thought, wow, this is the first time I realized that the timelines of things is very different for artists and institutions. So my desire to kind of recess and put this large shape into the wall was just some fanciful idea I had. I had no idea if it would work or if it would even look right. And so, you know, that I feel like that was a huge risk for me, but it was one I was willing to take. I thought, okay, if this turns out great, I'll tell everybody to come. And if I don't like it, I'm not gonna say anything. No, so that was a huge risk, but it ended up turning out okay. And the book covers came back. Each book cover had a different shape on it, so it kind of became this linguistic experiment to kind of denote what is inside, what is the book maybe, what is inside the book based on what is on the cover. And so I borrowed from a lot of artworks I'd already made in the archive, and I borrowed different shapes and forms from that. My husband actually made the desk, and the desk is quite exquisite. It has inlays in the surface of shapes, and I always knew I wanted a writing, like a writing desk. So there are books inside the desk, and this was the first time that we actually collaborated where both of us are kind of sited on the museum wall for it. And it was an opportunity to, like, you know, to bring in actual objects into the exhibition space. So this is another exhibition that I did where I'm thinking about language again and how it might operate. And for this exhibition, I painted floor plans of Mexican modernist interiors onto the wall. So they acted in some ways as kind of a theater set. I was thinking the theater, I was thinking like there's a kind of way that floor plans are narrating a kind of choreography that happens in daily life. And I thought of the script as the paintings themselves. You'll notice here that there's a painting here that has just 2 small paintings on the side and a recessed shape in the center. So this was also like me expanding and putting recessed shapes inside. You can't see it maybe in the slide as well, but I might have another image of it. So shadows on the wall, paintings, and then domestic objects. So there's definitely like this way that I'm thinking about the domestic object and referencing it through this kind of abstract language. There were small works, linen works. And for me, it really kind of brought together this way to think about shadows and the subtlety of a shadow and what is casting the shadow and where that's coming from. It was an opportunity to think about the mystery of a coded language and how that might be interpreted within a floor plan, alongside a floor plan as another site. And also just an opportunity to continue to play with the different compositions. A lot of these all came from cut paper, cutting out the interiors of the paper and putting objects inside. And then I'm gonna end with a project that I did. I was invited to do a wall mural out in Berkeley, California at the acronym is BAMFA, and I'm like the Berkeley Archive or Film Pacific. It's so many. I'm getting totally confused, but a few of you know what I mean. And so I'm gonna end with a video there. These last three paintings are more recent paintings, and you can see that the compositions are there's more experimentation. They're becoming more complex, bringing in geometries and line drawings, bringing in opacity of colors sitting on top of other shapes. There's more recessed spaces inside, even though it's a flattened space. Bringing this all together. And then here's the mural I did, which was shockingly, yes, I'm a painter, but working as a mural is a huge difference. It was a big learning curve. I brought in text, and I brought in some shadows underneath, and it was a lot of work. These are my three children. I thought that would be fun to show. My youngest is 7, Nina is 7, Kent is 8, and my stepdaughter Isabella is now 18, so busy. But I thought I would maybe end, if this will play. I don't know how to, let me see. It'll end with this. I took them there and my daughter immediately started dancing, and I thought, okay, maybe this is what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to like move someone to lose themselves in front of it. And I thought it was really exquisite and kind of great that she did that. So, and this is the last slide. This is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Wooden elements alongside painting. That's Belgian linen inset. Almost like a wooden inlay, but the painting is the inlay inside the wood. So anyway, thank you for watching. I hope that if you have any questions, you really just ask them, because I would love that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn, for a wonderful talk and for sharing so much of your practice and your, everyday practice with us. I think this is really exciting and rare to be so close in your process. And especially for me, it's interesting because obviously for Hamid Zénati, who has passed away, we can't ask these questions anymore, and it would be great. I mean, now I have all these questions that I would like to ask. So I guess that there's a younger generation of artists whom we have to consult, I think. And I'm really happy that you brought up the term freedom in such a prominent way, because as you also experienced yourself, I think it's important for his work, and it's kind of extraordinary how little how fearless he was with mark making. He left more than 1,000 works, and that's only the one that were in his possession by the time of his death. And so I think there is maybe a connection with, I mean, not only the extraordinary talent that you maybe both share, but also the kind of speed and the quantity one produces work in, because as you say, then there's little fear to fail if one has experienced that one can paint over it as you black out, or you recycle your work the next time, or you just do the next one if it doesn't work. So I think this is a kind of important experience that sometimes we maybe are so stuck in one thought. And I think what is also really quite impressive is how you're really a master of these wonderful varieties of shapes. So I feel like your sense of space is extraordinary, and I wonder how you, because you have mentioned film, and film has space and time, like how time plays into your paintings, like both in terms of working, so the speed you're working at, but also whether in the process of reading or watching a film, there's obviously like one of the key coordinates is time. So I don't know if you would like to comment on that.
No, it's a great question, and this has come up before. Well, people will ask me this very thing, the temporal aspects of watching a film, like how does that somehow translate with what I'm doing? And I think that there are time elements that read differently in painting. In painting, there's different ways that time is told through the quickness of the brushstroke. I think there's something that happens with the all black ground paintings. When I'm bringing the black over the top, there is a history that's underneath the surface, that's a bit of a slowness that's happening, and somehow those forms have arrived at the surface. And I think there's a distinct way that time works in those paintings. And then when you move to the Belgian linen, and you see a much more reduced palette, much more white space, I'll say, of the canvas, time is also different there. And I think what I'm after is what happens when they get into that space. I like there to be time considered between looking at maybe a large black painting and then moving to something else, and having that space in between as a moment to kind of breathe visually and then move on. I mean, I did show one installation where they're quite spread out. Like, I think they need time, visual time around them. And so what I'm working on in my studio right now, I mentioned to you earlier, they're white on white sculptures. And if you imagine a white sculpture sitting on a white wall, that temporally, there's a little bit of, first you have to articulate with your eyes what you're seeing, and that form looks like it came out of the wall, but it doesn't compete temporally the same as a painting that has all this activity. And I think that I'm trying to be very aware of time, the time it takes for the viewer to understand what they're looking at, and the time it takes to read that painting, the time it takes to read the image, and the time it takes to read the room. And so it's something I'm definitely working intuitively on those choices, but I think I'm really cognizant of how those things happen.
Yeah. When you presented your paintings and also your wall works, the question came up to me, like whether are you always clear about the orientation when you work, or would you consider, for example, placing them in a horizontal way so they could be read from all directions? Because this is something I also kind of thought about a lot, how to present, because in this case here it is not 100% clear, or it's only sometimes clear what the orientation of the image is. And I was wondering whether you ever tried to position something horizontally, and or would this change totally the concept?
I'm not so hard on the concept. You know, there are times like I have these 3 tables that kind of get pushed together and I lay them out. And when they're laid out, I see them so differently. I can see things in the surface that are really wonderful. And it makes me wonder, like maybe there is an opportunity to like lay these flat. And I've laid them on my studio floor many times when I'm getting ready to roll them up. And it's great to see something rolled out here and then something on the wall. So I'm not opposed to it. It is you get a different sense from them. You definitely see different things when they're on the wall. There's a way that I can stand close to them and then I look up, and the way the light hits them, you can see the outline of everything underneath so nicely. And I just think that sometimes some things are just lost in certain light, in certain situations.
And maybe my last question is, I mean, obviously your work is very dominated by flat shapes. So flatness definitely is something that you attracted to. And I wonder what your relationship between flatness and kind of depth is. Because especially, I mean, the cutouts and the working with paper, and even if it's not on paper but on canvas, the paper quality is still there, and this kind of lightness of a cutout. So I wonder whether you could speak to what flatness means for you.
I think my paintings often are very direct in showing you their origin. And I think that the origin of the flat cut paper is important to go back to. Also, they're almost emphatically flat. Like even though the black comes over them, that space isn't an incredible depth. It's an illusion of depth. It's something, it is literally under the surface, but it's not very, very deep. But I think there's influences that are from the graphic arts that come into my practice, like film posters. I just remember, like, and some of the text on that, those sources I feel like are evidenced because of the flatness and because of the graphic nature. I think of the old processes of a letterpress system on a paper and printing that. So in some ways there is even a relationship to printmaking, because printmaking is so flat. But I think it was early on, I feel like flatness was something that I could either figure out a way to work with it, like really lean into it, or I could have abandoned it and gone and learned how to make things in perspective, you know? And I think I just wanted to somehow champion flatness. So I continue. So I feel like it's emphatically flat for that reason.
All right, I think looking at the time, I think we have to close.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
and
Karen,
staying.
for coming.
Thank you so much. I know it was long.